They say trust is the foundation of any partnership. I learned it's also the weapon that destroys you. You know that feeling when everything you've worked for your entire life suddenly makes sense, when all the pieces fall into place and you realize you've been living the dream you always wanted. That's exactly how I felt walking into my retirement party 3 months ago. I was 58 years old, about to step away from the construction company I'd built from nothing, surrounded by everyone who mattered to me. The venue was perfect, the country club overlooking the lake where Trevor and I used to fish during our lunch breaks in the early days. Trevor Mitchell, my business partner for over 3 decades, had insisted on organizing everything himself. "You deserve this, Frank," he'd said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Let me handle all the details. You just show up and enjoy being celebrated." Looking back, I should have found it suspicious how eager he was to control every aspect of the evening. But Trevor had always been the social one, the schmoozer who handled client relationships while I focused on the actual construction work. It seemed natural that he'd want to throw me a proper send-off. The party was everything I could have hoped for. 200 guests filled the ballroom, clients we'd worked with for decades, subcontractors who'd become family, city officials who'd watched our small firm grow into the largest construction company in 3 counties. My wife Monica looked stunning in her navy dress, circulating through the crowd with that gracious smile I'd fallen in love with 26 years ago. Our kids were there too. Christina had flown in from Portland with her husband and my 2 grandkids. Even my son Bradley made it despite being in his final year of medical school. Seeing them all together, proud of what their old man had accomplished, filled me with a contentment I'd never experienced before. The evening flowed perfectly. Great food, better wine, and story after story about projects we'd completed, challenges we'd overcome, and the little company that somehow became a multi-million-dollar operation. I felt genuinely loved, genuinely appreciated for the work I'd put in all these years. Around 9 o'clock, Trevor stood up and tapped his wine glass with a knife. The room gradually quieted as conversations died down and all eyes turned toward him. He was wearing his best suit, the charcoal one Monica had helped him pick out for his daughter's wedding 2 years earlier. His face carried that confident smile he'd perfected during countless business presentations. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily across the room, "we're here tonight to celebrate my partner, my friend, and one of the finest men I've ever had the privilege of working alongside. Frank Brennan has given 30 years of his life to building something remarkable." The crowd murmured approval. I felt Monica squeeze my hand under the table. This was exactly the kind of tribute I'd hoped for but never expected. Trevor continued, his tone warm and appreciative. "Frank and I started Mitchell Brennan Construction in 1994 with nothing but a shared dream and a borrowed pickup truck. We've built shopping centers, office complexes, residential developments, and even that beautiful library downtown that won the State Architecture Award." More applause. I was genuinely moved by his words, thinking about all those early mornings we'd shared, planning projects over coffee and donuts, figuring out how to bid jobs we weren't sure we could handle. "But what makes tonight particularly special," Trevor said, pausing for effect, "is that it marks not just Frank's retirement but also a new chapter for our company." Something in his tone shifted, just slightly but enough to make me pay closer attention. The room remained focused on him, but I noticed his smile had changed. It was still there, but it felt different somehow, sharper. "You see," he continued, "Frank's retirement has created an opportunity for some important changes. Changes that will ensure our company continues to thrive and grow in the years ahead." I leaned forward slightly. This wasn't part of any conversation we'd had about my departure. We discussed transition plans extensively, and they all involved Trevor gradually buying out my shares over the next 5 years while maintaining the company structure we'd established. "Effective immediately," Trevor announced, his voice growing stronger and more confident, "Mitchell Brennan Construction will be restructuring. The company will be moving forward under new leadership and new ownership arrangements that better reflect the current market realities." The room was completely silent now. I could feel tension building, though I wasn't sure why. Monica's grip on my hand had tightened considerably. Trevor's smile broadened as he delivered his next words with the casual confidence of someone ordering coffee. "I'll be assuming full control of all company operations, assets, and client relationships. The transition has already been legally processed through our corporate attorneys." My blood went cold. "Trevor," I started to say, but he held up his hand. "I know this might come as a surprise to some of you," he said, addressing the room but looking directly at me. "But business is business, and sometimes personal feelings have to take a backseat to practical realities." The room erupted into confused murmuring. Several people turned to look at me, clearly expecting some kind of response or clarification, but I was too stunned to speak. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not like this, not after everything we'd built together. But Trevor wasn't finished. "I should also mention," he said, his voice carrying that same conversational tone he might use to discuss the weather, "that Monica has decided to join me in this new venture. In fact, she's been incredibly helpful in working out all the legal and financial details over the past several months." The bottom dropped out of my world. I turned to look at my wife, expecting to see confusion, outrage, or some indication that she was as blindsided by this as I was. Instead, I found her looking down at her hands, her face flushed with what I now recognize as guilt rather than embarrassment. "Monica," I whispered, but she couldn't meet my eyes. Trevor raised his glass in a toast. "So here's to new beginnings, profitable partnerships, and the future of what will now be Mitchell Construction with Monica as our new director of operations." The silence in that room was deafening. 200 people sat frozen, unsure whether they were witnessing some kind of elaborate joke or the most brutal public humiliation they'd ever seen. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as the reality of the situation crashed over me like a tsunami. My business partner of 30 years had just announced he was stealing my company. My wife of 26 years was apparently his accomplice, and they'd chosen to reveal this conspiracy at my own retirement party in front of everyone I cared about, everyone I'd worked with, everyone who respected me. But here's the thing about spending 3 decades in construction. You learn to prepare for problems before they happen. You develop contingency plans. You keep detailed records. And you never, ever trust anyone completely, not even your closest partner. Because 6 months earlier, I'd started noticing small discrepancies in our books. Nothing dramatic, just tiny inconsistencies that didn't quite add up. Being the careful, methodical person I am, I'd begun keeping my own private records. I'd also installed a small recording device in our main conference room after I noticed Trevor having several hushed phone conversations that stopped whenever I walked in. As Trevor continued his speech, explaining how the transition would benefit everyone and how I should be. Grateful for the opportunity to step away cleanly, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder, the same device that had captured dozens of conversations between Trevor and Monica over the past 4 months, planning exactly this moment. I stood up slowly, the recorder in my palm, and looked around the room at all those shocked faces. Then I looked at Trevor, who was still smiling like he'd just announced a company picnic. "Trevor," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly in the absolute silence, "before you go any further with this celebration, there's something I think our guests should hear." I pressed play and Monica's voice filled the room. "Are you sure Frank won't suspect anything? He's not stupid, Trevor. He's going to notice the money transfers eventually." Trevor's recorded response followed immediately. "By the time he figures it out, it'll be too late. The papers are already filed." His signatures were easy enough to forge. I've been watching him sign documents for 30 years. The color drained from Trevor's face as his own voice continued playing from the tiny speaker. "Besides, once we're married, everything will be legitimately ours anyway. Frank will get his little retirement party, and then he'll get exactly what he deserves, nothing." I let the recording play for another minute, capturing their detailed discussions about transferring assets, falsifying documents, and their timeline for getting divorced and remarried. The room remained absolutely silent except for those devastating voices laying out their conspiracy in clinical detail. When I finally turned off the recorder, Trevor was no longer smiling. Monica was crying, and everyone else was staring at them both with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest, "I believe Trevor was correct about one thing. Tonight does mark a new beginning." I pulled out my phone and dialed. Number I'd memorized 3 weeks earlier. "Detective Morrison, this is Frank Brennan. I'm ready to press charges for embezzlement and fraud. And yes, I have all the evidence you'll need." The next few hours were a blur of police interviews, shocked family members, and Trevor being led away in handcuffs while screaming about how I'd entrapped him. Monica left with her sister, unable to look at me or our children, as the reality of her betrayal sank in for everyone who'd witnessed it. 3 months later, Trevor is serving 18 months for embezzlement and fraud. The company assets have been recovered and are being held in escrow while the legal proceedings continue. Monica is living in a studio apartment across town, working as a receptionist and facing her own criminal charges, and me, I'm doing better than I ever imagined possible. The retirement I thought I wanted turned out to be exactly what I needed. I'm spending time with my grandkids, taking art classes, and slowly building relationships with people who actually deserve my trust. Sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you turns out to be the best thing that ever happened. You just have to be patient enough to see how the story really ends. The construction business taught me that the strongest foundations are built on solid ground, not shifting sand. Now I know the difference.